When most of us think about a black widow encounter, we're picturing an accident, you're reaching into a shed or maybe moving some old furniture, and you feel that sharp bite. It's scary, for sure, but it's usually a localized thing that doctors can manage.
But today we're going deep on a case that is, well, it's something else entirely. It just completely redraws the map for spider envenomation. We're looking at a medical report from January 2025 about a patient who made a really shocking choice. She decided to inject black widow venom directly into her veins.
Yeah, the source we're pulling from is this report, The Fatal High Intravenous Black Widow Envenomation. It details the whole medical saga of a 37-year-old woman in California. And her reason, which is just incredible, was that she was trying to get high.
Exactly. So our mission here is to go beyond the shock value. We need to really analyze what happens medically when a powerful neurotoxin completely bypasses the body's natural defenses. The toxicity she experienced was just profoundly amplified. It put the ICU clinicians in this incredibly high-stakes position, really testing the limits of their protocols.
We're going to break down the terrifying timeline of her symptoms, get into the biology of what a massive pure dose of this venom does, and look at the huge dilemma the doctors faced over using antivenom. Okay, let's unpack this. This route of exposure is so unusual. The preparation for this, the report lays it out in chilling detail. The 37-year-old woman told the doctor she took an entire black widow spider from the Latrodectus genus, and she ground it up. She then mixed it all into a suspension with about 10 milliliters of distilled water and then injected the whole thing.
And what's so critical here is that there's no delay, none. A normal bite, the venom has to seep through tissue, get into the lymph system, but this, intravenous, it hit her circulatory system, the body's superhighway, instantaneously.
So what was the timeline for the doctors? How quickly did she show up in a full-blown crisis?
Yeah, she got to the emergency department about 1 hour after the injection, and she was already in severe distress. That speed, that's the signature of IV exposure. The symptoms were classic for black widow bites, but just turned up to 11. Agonizing muscle cramps, everywhere. Her back, her abdomen, her thighs, just immense force.
It sounds absolutely overwhelming. What were her vitals looking like on the monitors?
Well, her vitals showed her whole system was under assault. The neurotoxin uptake was so fast, her pulse, her breathing rate, her blood pressure, all way, way up. She was extremely anxious, sweating profusely. Her temperature was 99.5, so not technically a fever, but it showed her body was already kicking into this massive fight-or-flight response.
Wow.
Yeah, it pointed directly to a huge sympathetic nervous system overload.
And it's just so striking that this full-body crisis was completely underway in just an hour. You think of a bite as, localized pain, then maybe cramps show up hours later. But injecting it meant the venom was just instantly everywhere, just wreaking havoc.
That is the absolute key difference. With a normal bite into the skin, the body can at least try to contain it, start an immune response locally. Here, all of that was just bypassed, gone. The full systemic effect started almost immediately, and it turned a localized injury into a rapid full-body toxic crisis.
Okay, let's shift from the crisis itself to the biology behind it. Why is this venom so incredibly potent, especially when it's amplified like this?
What's really fascinating here is the venom's main weapon. It's a component called alpha-latrotoxin, and this isn't just some generic poison. It's a very targeted neurotoxin. Its entire job is to latch onto your nerve endings and basically force them to dump all of their neurotransmitters at once.
And for those of us who aren't clinicians, what are those neurotransmitters doing?
They're the chemical messengers. They tell your muscles to contract, your organs to work. The toxin causes this flood of acetylcholine, which controls your voluntary muscles, and also norepinephrine, which controls that fight or flight response. So when they're just released uncontrollably, you get those horrible, painful, nonstop muscle spasms and that sympathetic overload we saw in her vital signs. The body is literally locked in a state of panic.
Which brings us to the dosage. This is the other shocking part. A spider bite is defensive. It's a tiny amount. She got the whole spider.
Right, and that's where the sheer scale of this intoxication comes into focus. The clinicians in the report cited specific data. A black widow's venom glands hold, on average, about 0.2 milligrams of venom. But she didn't just get the venom. She ground up the entire spider. So she got that 0.2 milligrams of neurotoxin, plus all the other proteins and inflammatory stuff from the rest of its body.
So the dose was, as the report says, orders of magnitude higher than usual. And then on top of that, you have all these other non-venomous but still potentially toxic proteins.
Precisely. And that massive, overwhelming dose meant her initial symptoms were just the beginning. Several hours after she was admitted, her condition got much, much worse. Her breathing became severely compromised. She developed this harsh wheezing, couldn't breathe, and they had to make an emergency transfer to the intensive care unit.
That sounds like a possible allergic reaction happening on top of everything else. Was that the suspicion?
It was a huge complicating factor. The patient, it turns out, had a history of asthma. So the physicians were pretty certain that her respiratory distress wasn't just from the neurotoxin. They thought it was being critically compounded by an allergic reaction, a bronchospasm, triggered by all those foreign proteins she'd injected. Her already sensitive airways were now fighting off both a neurotoxin and a massive inflammation.
That puts the ICU team in just an incredibly tough spot. You've got systemic poisoning, horrible pain, and acute respiratory failure that's being made worse by a pre-existing condition. Let's talk about what they tried first.
Right, so a standard treatment for severe spider bites is often intravenous calcium gluconate. The idea is that the calcium helps stabilize nerve cell membranes, which can sometimes counteract that forced release of neurotransmitters and ease the cramping.
But did it work here? In a case this extreme?
Unfortunately, no. The report is clear that her symptoms didn't really improve after the calcium gluconate. The sheer volume of toxin in her system just completely overwhelmed that standard countermeasure. So they had to pivot immediately to heavy pain control with morphine and just focus everything on her breathing, which was failing.
Okay, let's hone in on that breathing crisis in the ICU. When they saw the severe wheezing, the natural instinct is to treat it like a really bad asthma attack. What was their first move, and why didn't it work?
They did exactly that. They tried 3 separate treatments of albuterol, which is a common bronchodilator. It's supposed to relax the airway muscles. But the report says it was entirely ineffective. It didn't touch it. And that suggested this wasn't just a simple asthma flare-up. This was massive systemic inflammation and neurotoxin-driven airway restriction. Simple bronchodilators couldn't beat it.
3 doses failing.
Yeah.
That's a huge red flag. So they had to completely change strategy. What was the next pharmacological move?
They had to go bigger. They moved to aggressively fight the systemic inflammation itself. They started high-dose methylprednisolone, a really powerful corticosteroid, and followed that with nebulized treatments. It works by just globally suppressing the immune response and bringing down inflammation everywhere, trying to knock back that allergic reaction that was closing her lungs.
And this is where it gets really interesting, and you can see the experience of the ICU team. The decision about antivenin. It's the direct antidote, it's the textbook answer, but they decided against it. What was the risk calculation there?
This was the absolute crux of the issue. Black Widow antivenin works. It's very effective at neutralizing the toxin. But it has a known risk. It's derived from horse proteins, equine serum, and giving someone any foreign protein carries a risk of a severe allergic reaction called anaphylaxis.
And since she was already struggling to breathe, partly because of a probable allergic reaction, the risk of triggering full-blown anaphylaxis was just that much higher.
Exactly. The doctors were worried that the risk of causing a catastrophic anaphylactic shock, where her airways could swell completely shut in minutes, was greater than the benefit of neutralizing the venom, especially with her asthma history. They were afraid that giving her the antivenin could be the final trigger that sent her into respiratory arrest.
So they chose the slower path, supportive care. Rely on the body to clear the toxin rather than introduce another potentially fatal variable. What did that final supportive care plan look like?
It was all about stabilization and symptom relief. They continued the morphine for the pain, and they added lorazepam, which is a benzodiazepine. That helps ease the muscle spasms by calming the central nervous system. Essentially, they built a pharmacological fortress around her to protect her vital systems, manage her pain, and keep her breathing until her body could metabolize that huge toxic load on its own.
This case is it's a profound example of extreme toxicity. Well, let's put it in a bit of context. How often do things like this even happen?
Oh, they're incredibly rare. To connect it to the bigger picture, the National Poison Data System sees maybe 2,600 accidental Black Widow bites a year in the U.S. This kind of deliberate recreational use is highly, highly unusual. It really only shows up in medical literature because the scenario is so extreme.
And like you said, not all deliberate exposure is for a high. We saw that other case back in 2023 with a very different motivation.
That's right. The story about the 8-year-old boy in Bolivia, he intentionally let a Black Widow bite him because he thought it would give him Spider-Man powers. So the mindset is totally different, a high versus a childhood fantasy. But the medical result is the same, the deliberate introduction of a neurotoxin that requires critical care.
So if we pull back from the novelty of it all, what's the main takeaway lesson the clinicians from this case wanted to emphasize?
The central lesson they hammered home was the amplification effect. Injecting venom directly bypasses all of the body's defenses. It leads to immediate systemic shock. That's dangerous for anyone, obviously, but it becomes exponentially more life-threatening for someone with an underlying condition, especially something like asthma, where a massive inflammatory event can lead to intubation or worse very quickly.
The intensity of those first couple of days for that ICU team must have been incredible. But their supportive approach, it worked. How quickly did she recover?
The recovery, thankfully, was pretty fast once they got her breathing stabilized and the spasms under control. By the second day, her breathing was normal, her lungs sounded clear, and the muscle pain was gone. She was moved out of the ICU, and believe it or not, she was discharged the very next day.
A really successful outcome, all things considered. What were her follow-up instructions?
They sent her home with clear orders. She had to continue her regular asthma meds and also take a specific course of oral steroids. That was crucial to make sure any leftover systemic inflammation was totally squashed, preventing a rebound crisis after she left the hospital.
So we've really seen the overwhelming power of this massive, direct neurotoxin dose. It created this extreme medical challenge that required incredible clinical judgment. The doctors had to rely entirely on supportive care steroids, pain relief, muscle relaxants, instead of risking the standard antidote in a patient who was already so compromised.
And that raises a really important question for toxicology and critical care. Given this incredible dose and the fact that they completely avoided the antivenin, what does this case teach us about managing these extreme toxidromes? Specifically, how high does the risk have to be before we decide to abandon a standard neutralizing antidote and rely entirely on palliative measures, especially when a patient's underlying conditions just completely complicate their immune response? That's definitely something to mull over until our next deep dive.
A fascinating question and a profound reminder of just how complex clinical risk can be. Thank you for walking us through all of this.
Always a pleasure.
Until next time, stay curious. And maybe stick to avoiding black widows altogether.